Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers. I thank everybody that's involved with this process because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers.
Experience is not about the publisher, it is about us, the authors.
Good evening. My name is Barbara Hannon, and I am a storyteller, and the story that I'm going to share with you is in my book called Letters from World War II. This is the story of my parents and what they went through during World War II. It is a true story. It is a biography of what happened to them. It is a mystery in what happened to my father during the war. It is a love story between my parents who were separated during the war for over 4 years. And during those 4 years, the only thing that they had to connect each other were their letters. And that's how they kept their relationship alive. So it's a love story. But it is also very historical because it involves actual events from World War II. So that's my book. And the reason I wrote the book is because growing up, my sisters and I had absolutely no idea what happened to our parents during World War II. I am a member of the World War II generation's children. And for most of us, our parents, World War II veterans, never talked about the war. Once they came home and got into their lives, they just put it all behind them and never talked about it. So I am not very different from a lot of other children of World War II vets who really didn't know their parents' story during World War II. We did not know. We did not know what they went through. We did not know what happened to my dad. We just didn't know. They just never talked about it. So it wasn't that we did not know they were involved in World War II. This book, the picture on this book, this is my parents' wedding picture. And you can see my dad is clearly in uniform, and this picture was on our buffet in our dining room the entire time I was growing up. So we knew our dad was involved in World War II. The other thing that we knew when we were growing up about World War II is our family used to spend Jump Day. We'd celebrate Jump Day every year on January 11th. And Jump Day was, we celebrated that clear when I was in college. And I can see my dad still coming down from upstairs on January 11th. And he'd look at us, he'd come into the kitchen and he'd say, "It's Jump Day, let's have pancakes." It was a very special day. What we knew about Jump Day was that our dad jumped out of an airplane with a parachute, and he landed in the snow, and he took off his parachute and he buried it in the snow. And then he and the other guys who were on his airplane started walking, and they were picked up by the German police. And then he went to a prison camp, not a prison camp. And when we asked him about this camp, this prison camp, he used to say, well, we slept in barracks and we had bunk beds, and sometimes we cooked our food outside. We played outdoor games. We played baseball, a lot of baseball. So growing up, it sounded an awful lot to us like summer camp, don't you think? So really, as young kids, what we knew was our dad jumped out of an airplane. He was picked up by what he called the German police, and then he was in a prison camp. Was it bad? Well, when we were growing up, our dad told us, if you were ever in trouble, go find a policeman. Policemen are good. So that's about the extent of what we knew growing up. Our dad jumped out of a plane. The German police picked him up. He was in a prison camp. We didn't know why he was on a plane. We didn't know why he had to jump out of the plane. And that's about the extent of what we knew. But it was a really important day in our family. In fact, I remember coming home from college over a Christmas break, and still my dad comes down from upstairs. It's Jump Day. Sometimes he used to really joke about it. I grew up with 3 sisters. So there were 4 teenage girls in our house with 1 bathroom. And I remember once my dad came down from upstairs and said to all of us, if I would have known I was going to have 4 teenage girls in 1 bathroom, I never would have jumped. So that's about the extent of what we knew about World War II. And the years went by. As we got older, of course, we knew that our dad was a navigator on a B-17 bomber, that on a mission he was shot down, he bailed out, and he was captured and in a German prison camp. Still, not a lot of information. But over the years, my sisters and I never had really any idea that maybe there was something horrible about all of this. We just didn't know. And my parents just did not talk about it. So what happened was my mother died at the age of 93. And my sisters and I went to her house and began cleaning out her house. We thought we knew every single thing that was in her house, but we didn't. We found 2 boxes in the back of her bedroom closet that we had never seen before. And in one box, I opened up one box, and it was full of letters. And the letters were in groups with ribbons around them. So there were 4 or 5 groups of letters. And I picked up the first pack of letters, and the return address was Santa Ana Air Base in California. Well, I knew that's where my dad went to flight school. The second group of letters were from England, an air base in England. And I knew he was stationed in England. I had no idea where. So all of a sudden I've got this pack of letters that said Ridgewell Air Base, Essex, England. And I remember thinking, ooh, that's pretty cool. The third group of letters were very strange. I took them out, and they were long and thin and folded up. And they had German all over them, Mit Luftposta. And it said Stalag Luft 1, Bart, Germany, my dad's name, and underneath it, POW 1272. And I thought, these are letters from prison camp. I had no idea my dad could write my mom letters. And then the fourth group of letters were from a place called Saint Valery, France. I showed them to my sister and said, these letters are from France. When was Dad in France? How did he get to France? What was he doing in France? So my interest was piqued, and I decided to pack it all up and I'd bring it over to my house and read these letters eventually. The other box was full, crammed full to the top of all these unbelievable historical documents. I took the lid off. The very first thing I saw was a telegram, the Western Union telegram. It's kind of tissue papery and pink colored. And it said, to my mother, the Secretary of War regrets to inform you that your husband, Lieutenant George Hannon, has been missing over Germany since January 11th. And I thought, January 11th, my mom was being notified jump day. And then I looked at the date and it was the 26th of January. So my mother wasn't aware that my dad had been missing from January 11th to January 26th. And I looked through the box and I found a second telegram that was dated February 18th, 1944. And it said, to my mother, the Secretary of War would like to inform you that your husband, Second Lieutenant George Hannon, has been reported by the International Red Cross as a prisoner of Germany. And I looked at that and I suddenly thought, wait a minute. That's 37 days after jump day. 37 days. My mother did not know that my dad was dead or alive for 37 days. And then this telegram, I started thinking about it. What really did it say? He was a prisoner of the Germans. It was winter. I just really became focused on my mom and what she would have thought. It's winter. Does he have winter clothes? It's cold. Does he have food? Where is he? Is he hurt? Is he injured? Does he have medical care? I just really thought about my mom. Then it was not until May, when the next telegram came, that said he was a prisoner of war at Stalag 1 German prison camp in Bart, Germany, and she could write him at this address. So January, February, March, April, May, 5 months. And I had no idea. And I was really consumed thinking about my mother, that she lived through this. My mother died 10 years ago, and I could have asked her. I could have said to her, what was it like? What did you think? What was going through your head? But I didn't know. I had no idea. So I was never able to ask her. So what I did was I packed up these boxes, put the lids on, and I brought them to my house. And my intention was, when I retired, that I would go through these letters and I would go through these documents and read them. There was nothing in my head that said I'd write a book about it, but I just brought them to my house where they sat until COVID. When COVID came around, I needed a project. So one morning I made a big pot of coffee, sat down in the kitchen, and I decided to go through the documents first. I felt funny about all these letters and talked to my sisters about these letters. These clearly were personal letters between my mom and dad. And I just felt a little like a voyeur at first. And so I thought I'll just do the documents first, and then later I'll read some of the letters. So I started looking at these documents, and I cannot tell you how astounding and historical these documents are. My dad appears to have saved every single piece of paper the Air Force sent him. There were medical records, 2 or 3 sets of medical records from different places, all of his flight records from England, every flight, the number of hours he flew, what his target was, the time he left, the time he came back, whether he was the lead navigator for the squadron or not. I mean, just flight record after flight record after flight record. There was a commendation in there from Winston Churchill for some flights that he flew in October of 1944 and was the lead navigator. I was like, whoa, way cool, signed by Winston Churchill. There were all kinds of other communications to him. There were all of his German prison camp documents. You know, this one with his name, it was all in German. It had his picture, it had his fingerprints, but it was all in German. So I had to find someone to look at it and translate it for me. And really, I think the first inkling that I got that maybe this prison camp my dad was in was horrible was when this friend of mine looked at this and he turned it over on the back, and there were all these dates on the back. And he said, this list right here are punishments. Punishments? And he said, yeah, your dad was being punished. This one, I think, is for digging tunnels. This one is for what we would call, in the German word in English would be insubordination. Insubordination in a prison camp. And I thought, my dad went through some punishments here. It was very eye-opening, these documents. So one of the things about the documents that I noticed immediately is, if you have ever seen a World War II telegram that is now 80 years old, they were on these kind of pink tissue paper. They're very fragile. And these telegrams now are 80 years old. And so I thought, I need to preserve these documents or they're going to fall apart. So I got a desktop scanner and I started scanning all these documents into a digital file. But what I discovered, and this is how I started writing this book, with each document that I scanned, I thought, you know, these are just going to end up in a digital file. Whoever inherits this file, a grandchild, a great-grandchild, whoever inherits this is not going to have any idea what this document is and what it means unless I get online and put a story around each document and what that document was about and when it was and when that telegram came and what the telegram. And that's how the book started, is that in my efforts to describe what these documents were, I had to begin the story. But the interesting thing is, I really didn't know the whole story. I now was getting bits and pieces of what looked to me like really uncomfort stuff at this prison camp. The other thing that I scanned were some medical records. Every time my dad had a medical exam, he saved the record. So the first medical records that I looked at were from Santa Ana in 1942 when he went to flight school. And on that medical record, it listed his height as 5'5" and his weight as 164 pounds. He wasn't a big man. Then the next sort of weight that I found was an ID card for Ridgewell Air Base that had his name and his serial number, and it said dark hair, blue eyes, 5'5", 165 pounds. So that was the second weight. Then I looked at this medical record from a place called Camp Lucky Strike, St. Valery, France. I, at this time, didn't know what he was doing there, how he got there, but there was a medical record, and I knew by the date, June 15th, 1945, that it was after the war. And I'm looking at this medical record, and I noticed his weight was 132 pounds. So that's a 33-pound weight difference. And then there was a notation about his teeth that said all of his teeth would need to be removed due to rot and cavities from malnutrition. I looked at that and I suddenly thought, wait a minute, this prison camp, did they not get anything to eat? Was my dad starved? What? So immediately the detective work had to begin. It had to begin, and I had to figure out what happened. I did a lot of research, and I got on a plane and I went over to his air base in Essex, England. And they have a museum at Ridgewell that we went to. They have a wonderful curator who's an expert on World War II and the 381st Heavy Bomb Group that my dad was a member of, and what it was like flying these bombers. And just to get a sense of what it was like for my dad. And then this fall, I went to Bart, Germany, where Stalag Luft 1 prison camp was. The ground is still there. The camp was bulldozed over in 1945, but there is a museum with a curator who knows a lot about what happened at this camp to POWs like my dad. And that was a learning experience. And then I read everything I could find on Stalag Luft 1, the 8th Air Force, the 381st Division. There are, in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., are exposés about the camp, inspections on this prison camp by the International Red Cross. There were every single plane in World War II that went down has what's called a missing air crew report, a macro report. I wrote for those, and I got the report on exactly what happened to my dad's plane, how he was shot down, what air battle it was, even though I always knew it was Jump Day, January 11th. And I just absorbed everything I could possibly. I stopped writing and just read everything I could get my hands on about Stalag Luft 1, the 381st, the Air Force. And I learned a lot of things. One thing that I learned was when my dad was flying in 1943 and early 1944, this was long before the 8th Air Force had control of the skies over Germany, and Germany was winning. And at that time, people like my dad in these B-17s were pretty much sitting ducks. They had a 1 in 4 chance in late 1943, 1 in 4 chance of making it to 25 missions. 1 in 4. I had I had no idea, and I began to think about, he parachuted out of this plane, and somewhere I read a statistic that even though you successfully bail out of a B-17 bomber in World War II, you only had a 60% chance of making it to the ground. And I thought about those things, and I suddenly had such a different view of my parents. I said to one of my sisters, no wonder Daddy never talked about this. And at this point, I had put the timeline together, where he was, at what time, where he went, where he was at, but I had not opened a letter yet. And then one of my sisters came over, and the two of us started reading the letters. And I cannot tell you how difficult it was to start reading these letters. First of all, you don't expect your parents to write letters like these. My dad, every single letter to my mom said, "Dear Pumpkin, dearest Pumpkin." He had a name for her. And many of them are love letters. As their daughters, we had a little bit of discomfort when we first started reading them. But one of my sisters said, before my mother died, living in her house of 60 years, she tried very hard to get rid of stuff. She tried really hard to get rid of junk and papers and clothing. And she'd call us and say, "I've got some more boxes to go to Goodwill." My mother could have gotten rid of these 2 boxes, but she didn't. And I believe very strongly, that the reason that she did not get rid of these letters is because she wanted us to read them. While she was alive, just like 50 years ago, she couldn't talk about it. But after she died, I believe that she wanted us to read the letters. And the letters are absolutely stunning. Every letter. There is a letter from my mom to my dad in prison camp after he was shot down by a German fighter pilot and their plane almost exploded. After he did not return to the barracks in England, the Air Force packed up all his stuff, put it in a box, and mailed it to my mother. So my mother opened this box, and what she had were my dad's clothing. In fact, she wrote to him, "There's still mud on your trousers." And none of his clothing had been washed. And she writes in this letter how she held up his blouse. She called it a blouse. And it was almost like holding him and touching him to hold his shirt. When she got the very, very first letter from my dad, which was only a little postcard that said, "Dearest Pumpkin, I am safe. I am in a permanent prison camp. I'm not injured. We have food to eat," which wasn't true. "Food to eat. See you when the show is over." When she got that small card, she was ecstatic. And she wrote to him in prison camp that she took her finger and she traced his writing over and over on this card. And it was almost like touching his hand. I mean, my parents' letters were stunning. They did nothing but try very hard to keep each other's spirits up. They're positive. My dad from prison camp, even though now I know they were being starved, there were punishments going on. Even though I knew that, and my dad was undergoing that, not one word. He never said one word to my mother. In fact, some of his letters, he said, "I'm a really good cook." He wanted her to know that he had food when he didn't. So it was just this huge effort to be always positive, to keep each other's spirits up. My mother's letters were chatty, but she always told him, "My chin is up. My chin is up. I'm positive. I know I'm going to see you soon, and we're going to have a great life. And it starts the minute you come home." Not one word of anger in any of these letters. Not one word of "why me? Why did this happen to me?" Nothing like that. No anger at the world, the government, nothing. Just my dad clearly, when he was in England, was frightened. He wrote to my mother that it was getting harder and harder to get into the plane every day and fly. And he said, your life hangs in the balance and you don't know what's going to happen. But I signed up for this job and I will do it to the best of my ability, no matter what happens. That was in one of my dad's letters. And it is just amazing how they wrote to each other in this positive way. And they didn't know what was going to happen. Every Christmas Eve, year after year, they wrote each other and said the same thing to each other. I know in my heart we'll be together next year and then we'll never be apart for a Christmas again. But of course, they were. So it was difficult. So the book, the story kind of unfolds matching the letters, when he was in Ridgewell, the letters that he wrote back and in prison camp. And the other big, huge thing with this book is, as I said earlier, my sisters and I had no idea why my dad was in France or how he got to France. And that is a mystery. And that is an incredible story, how these 8,000, most of them there were 8,000 U.S. Army Air Corps officers in this camp with my dad and 1,000 RAF. And they were all commissioned officers because Goering, the general, German Luftwaffe general who ran this camp, had a funny thing about commissioned officers, that they should be separate. So they were all commissioned officers. But this camp in Barth is clear up on the Baltic. And if you know your history, that area of Germany was Russian territory, and then it became East Germany. So at the end of the war, my dad and these other 8,000 guys are in this POW camp, clear up in Russian territory under the Russians. How did they get out of there? And that was an astounding story, how my dad got out of there to France. And if you want to know, you got to read the book and figure out that mystery. So it was an astounding story. I was just shocked how he got out of this prison camp. And he never said a word. So that's my book. As I said, I began writing it for my own purpose. What happened? I wrote it because I wanted to preserve a lot of these documents. And I wrote it for his children, his grandchildren, and now his great-grandchildren, so that they would know what their grandfather did. And it's a story, I believe, that transcends time. It is courageous. The courage of this generation, this World War II generation, unquestioning commitment. People could learn a lot today, how people like my parents, what they did to get through these 4 years, unimaginable. People today cannot imagine. The last thing I'm going to say is that it's really funny. My mom told me when she was still alive that she had a friend whose granddaughter was married to a soldier in Afghanistan. And she told my mother that at night, at 3:00 in the morning, her granddaughter would get up and Skype to her husband in Afghanistan. My mother did not want to show that she didn't understand what Skype was. So she came to me and said, "What is Skyping?" Mona's granddaughter Skypes with her husband in Afghanistan. And I told her what it was. My mother was awestruck. She just stood there and said, "What?" She could see and talk to her husband in a war zone. And I said, yeah, times have changed. for her, when my dad went off to England in August of 1943, he thought he'd be home by Easter, get his 25 missions done and be home. When he took off in August, my mom didn't see him for 2 years. And part of that time, she didn't know where he was. So the strength and resilience of people like my mom, who never gave up, never got mad, never got angry, just day after day made a point to cheer up my dad, keep his spirits up in her letters, and wait and hope. And if you read my book, it's very historic. The places he bombed, the things he did, the prison camp, this is all true based on a lot of research that I did. And when I went to the location of the prison camp in Barth this last fall, the curator of the museum, who took me out there to see the ground and where the prison camp was, when the war was over, the Germans just bulldozed the camp. They just bulldozed it down. And we're walking around, and he's showing me where my dad's barracks would have been, and the commandant's office, and the guard towers. And he kind of kicked his foot in the ground, and he pulled up a little brick, a little piece of brick, red brick. And he handed it to me, and he said, "Part of your dad's barracks." That little piece of brick, just I carry it with me all the time. So that is my story. I am kind of an accidental author. I did not set out to write the book. The book happened, and I hope people will read it and just admire what my parents' generation did. I don't think my parents were unusual. Extraordinary events happened to a lot of World War II people. But this is my parents' story, and I am very, very proud of them. Proud of them. I wish they were still alive and I could tell them. But this is the best I can do, is keep their story alive. Anybody have any questions? Okay, thank you very much for listening.